Hello, and welcome back to the MCYT Metazine. I'm Fallguy, here with Aviva, whose piece accompanies Bird's Apocalypses of Hermitcraft 8 and Empires 1. So, first of all, I just wanted to ask, when you saw the list of prompts the analysts had proposed, what drew you to this piece in particular?
Well, for me, a couple years ago, when I was in college for my contemporary art class, I somehow got my professor to let me do an analysis on basically comparing the Hermitcraft Season 8 moon apocalypse thing with Truly Bedrock Season 1's own moon themed apocalypse. And I thought it was really interesting to see someone going at an analysis of one of the same apocalypses and comparing another from a completely different angle than to how I had analyzed it myself.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you've touched on this topic before, even outside of specifically MCYT space, except of course this time you're an artist for it.
Yeah, I mean, someday I'd like to properly put that together into maybe a video essay or something, because I wasn't completely happy with how it turned out because I had to spend a majority of it just explaining medium, because it was to a class of art students, most of whom were traditional artists and not even digital artists. So it was a very different thing than they were used to.
Yeah, of course. What would you most like people to take away from your piece?
Honestly, I don't have anything really specific in mind. I think probably just get them thinking about I guess thinking coming up with their own theories and comparisons for different sort of disasters in MCYT and SMPs, because it is sort of a running theme for a lot of SMPs that if they don't just end, if they have a definitive ending, they end on a disaster, and thinking about why that is, pairing them, I think just getting people thinking about something and enjoying it and noticing that is a thing that keeps happening.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it is a nice, solid way to end an SMP. Well, the world's gone, can't play on it anymore.
hmm
Similar to that one, I've been asking this of everyone, what are you proudest of in your piece?
I think the composition, I'm not 100% happy with it, but I did a couple different thumbnails, and this was actually, I think, the second one I did, and just coming up with the composition of having the opposing different parts, like the spaceship versus dragon, and not having them directly across from each other and coming sort of crossing against each other in a way that keeps your eye looking all over it instead of having one focus. I think I'm pretty happy with how that turned out.
Yeah, and I do like how the spaceship and the dragon's wing are parallel to each other, as opposed to the purple beam and the lava, which are, straight up and down. I think that contrasts nicely, those angles.
Mhm.
Is there anything from this piece or the process that you'll be taking with you into the future?
So the style I did here was it's slightly different from my sort of default style. It's something I've been experimenting with a bit more with. I tend to draw characters and very much humanoid characters the most. And I sort of have to push myself when I do buildings and anything non-organic especially. And I was able to merge that here with the organics and non-organics. And I think definitely working more in the future is definitely a step towards doing more like buildings and stuff that isn't just humanoid characters.
Yeah, that's definitely a very different skill, and definitely one that's very good to have, especially for doing backgrounds.
hmm
Is there anything else from the creative process that you'd like to share, or any details that you'd like to point out?
Well, I will say that this is definitely a scaled down version of what I sort of originally envisioned for this piece, but due to time constraints and being very busy, sort of came up with a version of it that had core aspects of it and focused on those. But ideally, I would like to have more parts that compare to each other, especially showing how each characters, like the players on each server, sort of compare to each other in who took similar roles and such. So while I am happy with the core of the piece, this is sort of a simplified down version of my original vision for this.
Yeah, I think that happened to a lot of analysts too, not necessarily just for time constraints, but also because we had a word limit, and a lot of the pieces here, I think, got a little bit pared down from what several people were hoping.
hmm
And I do hope that a lot of you maybe post the longer versions someday. I think that would be wonderful to see.
Yeah.
So, going a bit more general, what is your favorite aspect of your art style?
I'm not really sure because I enjoy doing how I do coloring. And then also, for me, posing is a lot of fun with characters, especially. With this, you can see the dragon is a very dynamic pose. And I definitely enjoy, especially in the sketch, coming up with posing and composition.
Yeah, and that makes or breaks a piece, I would argue, just the composition itself. You've clearly drawn notable objects and events from MCYT apocalypses. So, for our readers who maybe aren't familiar with multiple SMPs, which elements are from which series?
Well, here's primarily comparing a Hermitcraft Season 8 in their Moon's Big Apocalypse to Empire Season 1, whose apocalypse was several different things, but the main thing I drew in here is F-Whip's sort of reactor, no, it was a forge. Implosion caused this massive lava drip thing sort of in the sky. So we have the two parts of the apocalypse, the moon and the forge implosion. Then next comparing, I sort of picked two flying things. First is one of Jem's dragons from the Crystal Cliffs, which were, I would say, a pretty big part of her story, but it was limited really to her part of the story specifically, unless because there was another dragon that was more of that, but I chose to do one of the ones that she had as a build because I thought that was more interesting than doing the one that was just a character. And then opposite is the Prometheus, which was how Doc and Ren sort of had their own separate storyline to the rest of the Moon's Big storyline in season 8, where turns out, at least from their point of view, it was all a simulation taking place on this Prometheus ship that stored memories and stuff from previous seasons of Hermitcraft. So I sort of picked those because there's parts that were big parts, depending on who you were watching, but if you were watching a different point of view, you could have totally missed it. And then lastly, for the bottom two, I chose sort of two iconic builds that I'd say sort of were skyline builds that you'd often see in the server. On the left is Rian's Mountains that he built in Bodum. Part of why I chose it, so I realized all the other Hermitcraft parts were gray. Although there are a lot of other iconic builds in Hermitcraft Season 8, I felt this was the most in tone with the palette for the Hermitcraft side. And also I had meticulously 3D modeled this for a completely different project. So some of how it's drawn is actually inspired by that 3D model I had to do. And then lastly is the Prismarine Palace from Lizzie's Ocean Empire, which I sort of chose because when I think of Empires, season 1, it's one of the first builds I think of. All the time I'd see it on the skyline and other people's builds, and it's just so memorable specifically. So I felt that that was a good choice, and it also worked well with the sort of color palette of the dragon.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for explaining. I'm not super familiar with too much of Empires. I think the Prismarine Palace was a good choice because I do know, I know of that one and I'm not super familiar with the builds. But Fwip's lore seems very interesting there. And I do see what you've done with sort of dividing the color of Empires with the gray of Hermitcraft, which I think sort of speaks to what the server's lore is in general, in that Hermitcraft is rather industrial, whereas Empires was rather lore-based and very much focused on storytelling and things like that. Despite the bright interruption of the orange and purple, your color palette is quite complementary. Were you drawing from a specific canon, or just the main colors of the end and the builds that you'd chosen?
Partially both. So for Hermitcraft, I did want to stay more gray because a lot of the analysis piece that goes with is about how Hermitcraft had a sci-fi apocalypse, while Empires was more of a fantasy apocalypse. I sort of see sci-fi as being a lot more drab and gray. Fantasy's a lot more colorful and bright. And one thing I didn't explain in the last question is the purple streak going through. That's actually not related to either apocalypse. It is part of the motif of the crossover that happened between Hermitcraft and Empires in the later season. And I found it interesting that that happened in the season after for both, because it happened in Hermitcraft Season 9 and Empire Season 2. So I felt since it's so the rift is so heavily associated with the sort of crossover between the two servers, I felt it would be a good interruption between the two. I do feel it blends in a little more with the Empires than I intended, because that also has sort of a purple color palette, but I wanted it to sort of be as a thing showing that while they're crossing over, there is this rift between them.
Yeah, I think that's definitely nice to bring in. I also wanted to point out the very background of your piece. That's a very interesting interpretation of the end sky. Rather than stars, you've got swirls. Where does that come from?
So I've been working as a colorist for a comic that is not out yet and it's not going to be out for a while. And that is just one of the brushes that we use a lot for effects, me and the other colorists. So I've gotten to the habit of just using it for background effects so it wouldn't be completely flat.
Oh, that's very interesting.
And I thought it looked interesting.
Yeah, it definitely does. It's a new thing I haven't seen before, and I like it. So you've got a rounded, rather lively style for shading and highlights that makes the characters pop, and you don't have any humanoid characters in this piece naturally, but I can still see it shining through. I think it really adds to the depth of your work. How did you hone that style? Were you inspired by anything, or did it happen naturally as your artistry developed?
I think it definitely happened naturally because a lot of my art style developed from making Minecraft fan art in the early 2010s and like mid 2010s when the sort of popular style was much more blocky and Minecrafty. And then also at the same time, I was making a lot of My Little Pony fan art, which I think you can see a lot in the influence from My Little Pony in this when you think about it. It definitely had a very big influence on my art style.
Yeah, now that you say that, I do see it. It's not anything that, like, popped out at me as, oh, this person used to draw My Little Pony, but I do see it. I think it works well for your piece and your style overall.
Thanks.
So, finally, what made you decide to add the slight chromatic aberration or the glitch effect to your piece?
Well, part of it is I always like to have some extra texture or stuff on my piece, on my work, and usually like slap gradients and try a couple textures with this. And part of it is that I found that this is what looked best of what I tried, but also sort of a nod to part of one of the storylines referenced in this with the Hermethius, with Doc and Ren and their simulation, and they used a lot of like glitch effects, chromatic aberration. And I feel it also sort of fits with the theme of the rift. And in general, there's a lot of strange things that happened in empires. And I feel it also just fits well with the theme of this all takes place in a video game. It's sort of up to interpretation of how much of SMPs are like the world is a video game versus not, but I feel it's really integral to the medium. So yeah, there's a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, it pulls the piece together, and I know what you mean about adding a texture over top. I think that it is very nice to have on pieces, and you've done it very well here. Well, that's all of the questions that I have for you. Thank you for your time and for answering all of our questions.
Thank you so much for interviewing me. I think this went well.
Of course, you can check out this piece and all the other pieces for the MCYT magazine when it releases. See you then!